Institute. This is Tola.
أهلا وسهلا. You are welcome.
Welcome, Doctor. Nice to meet you. Welcome. How are you?
I'm very fine, thank you. Me too. I really appreciate Khalid, Dr. Khalid, to facilitate this and join me in your team.
You are welcome.
I am very happy.
You are welcome.
So thank you very much, Dr. Tola, for accepting sharing us this presentation, this scientific presentation about cohort study. Let I introduce the Dean actually is sharing us some things in some other work. Here we have Dr. Askari, the head of the nursing department.
Sorry, I missed this PowerPoint. Khadora.
Yes, I think now it's okay.
I missed this PowerPoint. Yes, now it's okay. Now it's okay.
Now it's okay.
Yes, okay. So please go back one slide. Yes. Now the main limitation in cross-sectional in the case control study is problems in determining whether the exposure or risk factor precedes the disease or outcome of interest. So during the case control in the cross-sectional study, we don't know whether the risk is precede the outcome or the outcome precedes the risk. So this problem will overcome by designing the by using cohort study. Presence or absence of risk factors is determined before outcome of interest occur. So the problem regarding the cross-sectional and the case control overcome by sampling a patients who are free from the disease and we follow for the long period or any scheduled time. Next slide, please. The word cohort is derived from the Latin word called cohors. In ancient Roman Empire military unit, a band of warriors is called cohorts. A group of persons with a common statistical characteristics also called cohorts. Then that derived to cohort study. In epidemiological terms, cohort is a group of people who share common characteristics or experience within the defined period of time. Birth cohort, marriage cohort, employment cohort, etc. are the example of cohorts in epidemiological study. Next. Cohort study is a type of analytical study design which is undertaken to determine additional evidence to refuse or support an existing association between suspected causes in the disease. So it helps to know whether a given risk factor or exposure is a risk of a given disease or not by understanding which precedes which. Risk precedes an outcome or outcome precedes the risk. So it is very important to know when we use a cohort study. The other name of cohort study are longitudinal study, incidence study, and the forward-looking study. We can use alternatively as longitudinal study or incidence study or forward-looking study as the name of cohort study. Next, characteristics of cohort study. Cohort study has certain characteristics. Those are cohorts are identified before the occurrence of the disease under investigation. So we have to have a cohort. We have to identify a cohort before occurrence of the disease. The study groups are observed for a period of time to determine the frequency of the disease among the groups. among exposed or exposed. The frequency of disease among exposed or not exposed. The study goes from cause to effect. We start by cause, then we observe, start by risk on cohort. Yes, okay. Cohort study following a group of population over the time. When we have two groups, exposed group to the risk, then not exposed to the risk. Then we follow for a certain time or period. Then we measure the frequency of disease among those exposed in the developed outcome, and those others who do not develop the outcome. Again, similarly from not exposed, we see those developed the disease or those without the disease or the outcome. Next. When the implementation of cohort study is an indication, when we use the cohort study, at what time, at what precondition? One, there is good evidence of an association between an exposure and the disease from the previous descriptive in the case control study. Yes, so before planning a cohort study, we have to evidence the association between exposure and the outcome by conducting a descriptive study like cross-sectional, case series, any type in the case control study. So if we have evidence, sufficient evidence, the association between exposure and the outcome or the disease, we can think to design the cohort study. The next is exposure is rare. When the exposure is rare, but the incidence is high among exposed people. We have to be sure about this. The third, attrition of the study participants can be minimized. Cohort should be stable. That attrition means missing, loss of a participant. If the loss is minimized, we can think to design. If the participant, the cohort is stable. So we can think to design. For example, if we design a refugee in a refugee cohort in a refugee for 10 years, we will face attrition, a lot of attrition. The participants, the cohorts maybe go to another country, we cannot catch them. So at that time, we cannot think to design a cohort study. The last is required amount of time in the fund are available. We have to think about the time period and the availability of the fund. If we don't have money, we cannot design a cohort study. So these are an indication for designing a cohort study. Unless otherwise, we cannot. Next, characteristic of cohort population. We have a population which called is a cohort. They have their own characteristic, about 4 characteristics. The first is cohort must be free from disease under study. They must be free from a disease under study. The other is both exposed and the unexposed groups should be equally susceptible to the disease under study. Exposed and unexposed groups must be equally susceptible to the risk. When I say if they are differently susceptible, we are systematically engaged in a bias. For example, if we wanted to compare or conduct a cohort on the people who are working in a mining area and who are working in a civil servant area. If we use, for example, we wanted to study the lung cancer among gold miners, then this group are exposed to silicon or silica or any carcinogenic materials. And again, if we use an exposed group who are working in a village or in a city, This is completely different group in the exposure level are completely different. So we cannot use. They have to equal susceptible to the disease and steady, both. Okay, both exposed and unexposed groups must be comparable in the respect to all variables which influences the occurrence of the disease. Yeah, the people have their own characteristics. When we allocate, of course, it's non-randomized. It's non-randomized. But their characteristics approximately similar among exposed and unexposed. Among exposed and unexposed. Diagnostic and eligibility criteria of the disease must be defined before the implementation of the follow-up. So we have to define our diagnostic criteria, how we assure whether the disease occurred or not, or we have to set our clear eligibility criteria before the implementation of the follow-up. So next, Dr. Khalid. Yeah. Okay, general consideration while selection of cohorts. When I say cohorts are people who are going to study it is starting with a reference population. We have a reference population, then we have to sample representative sample who have certain characteristics, exposed group. And again, with other who do not have those characteristics, unexposed group. The next, both groups be free from the condition, okay, from the conditions or outcome under study. They must be free from the disease we are going to study. Both groups should be equally susceptible to the disease under study. Both groups should be comparable. They must be compared to each other. There shouldn't be some differences between. Approximately is not absolute actually, since we never randomized reallocated them. Both groups observed over a specified period to determine the risk. Each group has to develop the condition or outcome of interest. So we have to follow equally both exposed and unexposed groups. Okay, elements of cohort studies, selection of study participants. We have to select the participants properly, obtaining data on exposure, whether they exposed or certain risk or not. We have to assure selection of comparison group. We have to systematically select the comparison group or unexposed group. We have to follow for certain time. Then we have to analyze our result and draw the conclusion. Next, selection of study participants. We have to start from general population. Whole population in a certain area can be a cohort, or a representative sample can be sampled from the general population. Next, a special group of population can be a cohort. Select groups such as occupational group, professional groups like those study. We will see in the example of cohort study. Exposure groups, person having exposure to some physical, chemical, or biological agents. For example, X-ray exposure to radiologists. Next, Dr. Kadura, next. Obtaining data on exposure. How we can obtain data on exposure? Personal interview. We can send mail questions. We can send questions through mails. Reviews of records. We can review the records. Dose of drug, radiation, type of surgery. We can collect from the records. Medical examination or special tests. We can request examination or special tests like blood pressure, serum cholesterol, sugar level, everything we can measure. Environmental survey, we can survey the environment to get the exposure level. By obtaining the data of exposure, we can classify cohorts as exposed and unexposed. By degree of exposure, we can subclassify cohorts as first degree of exposure, second degree of exposure, third degree, etc. We can classify like that. Next, selection of comparison groups. Okay, an exposed group, I mean. Internal comparison, I mean. We can use internal comparison. Only one cohort involved in the study, then we can select from that cohort an exposed group. The other is subclassified in the internal comparison done. We can subclassify them, as I have said, by exposure level. And we can use as a comparison. Another is external comparison. We can use external cohort. More than one cohort is a study for the purpose of comparison. We can use different cohort to compare. Cohort, for example, cohort of radiologists compared with ophthalmologists. The next is comparison with general population. General population rates, for example. If no comparison group is available, we can compare the rates of study cohort with general population. For example, cancer rate of uranium miners with the general population, cancer in general population. So it's very easy. Next, next, follow up. So how we follow up the cohorts to obtain data about outcome to be determined, or morbidity or death. We can send mail questions whether they sick or not, or whether they died or not to now. We can send mail questionnaire or telephone calls, personal interview we can conduct, yeah. Periodic medical examination, we can appoint them, then we can examine their medical status. Then reviewing records, we can get from the record whether the patient sick or not, or dead or not. Surveillance of days records, we can see days records from the days registry if is available. Follow-up is the most critical part of the study. So cohort has a follow-up period. That follow-up period must be clearly indicated before the implementation of the study. Some loss to follow-up is inevitable due to days change of address, migration, change of occupation. So we have to take care about loss also. If we lost many participants, we cannot analyze the data easily. The other is loss to follow-up is one of the drawbacks of the cohort study. We have to note also this. Next. Next, okay. Cohort study design, how we can design. Pictorially, we start from study population, general population, then we allocate into two, exposed and unexposed by screening them. Actually, as I have said, is non-randomized allocation, is natural allocation. The next, then they after a certain time of a certain period of follow-up, we measure the frequency of the disease in exposed group. And again, those do not develop the disease in exposed group. Again, we measure the frequency of the disease in an exposed group and the frequency of those do not develop the disease. So this is a classical design of cohort study. Next, yes, we have the same design. We can see from the table or cohort of identified population. Then we classified into exposed and the not exposed. Then follow up. Then we measure the frequency of exposed people and have a disease. And again, the frequency of people who exposed in the not have a disease. In the next, there's the other group, not exposed group, and having a disease, C, and those who have no, who do not expose and do not develop a disease. So A, okay, A indicates those exposed in the developed disease. B indicates exposed in the do not develop a disease. C indicates those do not exposed in but develop a disease. And D indicates those do not exposed in the do not develop a disease. A plus B is steady exposed cohort part, while C plus D is control or unexposed cohort. Next. Retrospective and prospective cohort study. Next.
Yes.
Kadura, next.
Yes.
Okay, prospective cohort studies design. We, as I have said before, we start our study with the cohorts who exposed previously, and then follow them until the disease occur. This is one type of method to follow the cohort. The other is we recruit a cohort participant before the exposure. Then we measure the exposure. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Are you hearing me? Okay.
Yes.
Then we start by defining our study participant, a group of population or a cohort. Then we screen exposure level. Then we follow them until the disease occurs. So we can start up before the exposure happen, or we can start after the exposure happen. So it's prospective cohort study. We start by the general population as before, general population who living in certain area. Then we allocate them randomly, actually not we, naturally allocated into exposed and unexposed at present time or at the future time, as I've showed you in the previous slide. Then we measure the frequency of disease in exposed group and the frequency of do not develop disease in the exposed group. Similarly, we measure the frequency of disease unexposed group and those do not develop the disease, the frequency of do not develop the disease. Next, Adura?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So there is example of prospective cohort study. There is wonderful global prospective study, which is the Framingham health study. We can click on this link and you can read about the Framingham cohort study. It is a well-known and through generation cohort study. This cohort study, Framingham cohort study, started in 1948 to study the relationship of variety of factors to the subsequent development of heart disease within 5,127 samples who were in 13 to 59 years old at Framingham, USA. Study participants were examined every 2 years for 20 years. The study found that hypertensive, tobacco smoking, elevated blood cholesterol are associated with chronic heart disease. The increased physical activity associated with decreased risk of chronic heart disease. So you can find this study and you can see how cohort can be designed in the very fantastic in the generation through generation cohort study, prospective cohort study actually. So limitation of prospective cohort study, everything has limitation, so we can compensate or we can use with their limitation. The first limitation is study might take long duration. If it is long duration, we can take a measure to decrease the burden of disease. The next is sufficient amount of funding for long period. It needs a huge amount of money. So we have to show whether we have money or not to implement a prospective cohort study. The other is missing of study participant or attrition. We miss a lot of participants, so we have to take care about it also. The next is retrospective cohort study. Is a cohort study, is a cohort study in which the outcome have occurred before the study started, before the study starts, the outcome already assured or known. Investigator goes back to the past registration and select the participants from existing records. There must be strong registration to implement a retrospective cohort study. So we start from the outcome, then we see the risk factor and the outcome simultaneously from the registration. It is also called historical cohort or non-concurrent cohort study. So we start with outcome happened before, then we collect our data from the record and see the exposure, whether the exposure is a risk or not. Please, next slide.
Yes.
Okay, retrospective cohort study design. Pictorially, we start by a study population, then random assignment at past time, randomly, naturally, assigned into exposed and unexposed. So at past time also, they have developed a disease or they do not develop the disease among those exposed. Similarly, they developed the disease or they do not develop the disease among unexposed. So we measure the frequency of the occurrence of a disease in exposed group and the do not exposed group. Then we compare whether there is significant difference based on their exposure. Next slide. Okay, example, retrospective cohort study. This example is my work. I have implemented a retrospective cohort study for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in Ethiopia at national level. So it has published online on Nature a journal, which is called a scientific report. You can find from the link below. So suppose that an investigator started the study with the effect of treatment interruption, on multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Then they use TB registration book, very strong registration books that contains the treatment information from 2009 to 2019. Using this data record, so the pictorially you can see from here again, all patients registered for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis treatment. Then they randomly allocated to treatment not interrupted group and the treatment interrupted group. So of those treatment not interrupted, we measured the successful treatment outcome, cured or treatment completed, and the other is successful treatment outcome. And similarly, in treatment interrupted group, we measured the frequency of successful treatment outcome and unsuccessful treatment outcome. After we compared, there was significant difference between those treatment interrupted or not treatment interrupted. The third cohort study design is Ambidirectional cohort study. It is a combination of prospective and the retrospective cohort study. The cohort is identified from past records. We see from past records and identify data on outcome simultaneously from the past. Then the same cohort is followed prospectively into future for the further assessment of outcome. So when we look at from this picture, the outcome already is occurred. So we look at the exposure, previous exposure. After we ascertain the risk is exposure is a risk of outcome or a disease, then we follow them to assure whether this exposure is actually a risk. Next slide. Example of ambidirectional cohort study. So you can find also this study from the link below. Carl Braun and Dole's study on effect of radiation begins in 1955 with 30,352 patients who received large dose of radiation therapy for ankylosing or spondylitis between 1934 to 1954. Outcome evaluated was days from leukemia or aplastic anemia between 1934 and 1954. So a prospective component was added up in 1955, and the surviving participants were followed up to the occurrence of the days subsequently in the following years. So you can see, you can read from the link below. Okay, next. Okay, let we compare retrospective and the prospective cohort, their limitation and their strengths. Then on data quality, retrospective study cohort is less complete and less accurate. Prospective is great completed and greatly accurate. The emerging new exposure can be emerging during follow-up, is during retrospective not useful because we haven't registered emerging exposure, another exposure I mean. So during retrospective it is very useful because it may lead to attrition. So costs, retrospective is low or cheap, prospective is high or very expensive. Time required for prospective is shorter, and for retrospective is shorter, for prospective is longer. Next slide. Next, Dr. Karo. Okay, measure of disease burden and the measure of association during cohort study. We have to analyze our data after we design in the follow them, collect the data, ascertain the outcomes, then we have to analyze. So there are two types of measurement. One is measure of disease burden in a cohort, and the other is measure of association in a cohort. As measure of disease burden is incidence rate is one, the other is risk or incidence risk. Yes, risk and the incidence risk are the same. So measure of association in a cohort, relative risk, risk difference, attributable risk, population attributable risk, percentage population attributable risk, in the rate ratio. So we will see one by one. Incidence rate takes into account the time an individual is at risk of disease. It is not proportion since it defines the number of cases per time at risk. So it accounts time under which the participants are observed. Again, incidence rate or person time rate is a measure of incidence that incorporates time directly into the denominator. So our denominator is time under which participant observed. Incidence risk and the incidence rate are often confusing. They sometimes overlapped. So incidence rate, incidence is the number of incidence rate equal to number of the new cases of the disease during a specified period divided by total time each person was observed. Example, the diabetes follow-up study includes 218 diabetic women and 3,852 non-diabetic women. By the end of the study, 72 of the diabetic women and 511 of the non-diabetic women had died. The diabetic women were observed for a total of 1,862 person years. The non-diabetic women were observed for a total of 36,653 person years. Calculate the incidence rate of days for the diabetic and the non-diabetic woman. Next slide, Kadura. Is the problem clear? Yeah? So solution. We can see the table below. Diabetic status, yes, no. Days occurred among this amount, person year, and the incidence. So for diabetic woman, numerator is 72 and the denominator is 1,862. Person time rate is equal to 72 divided by 1,862. Then the result is 0.0387 days per person year. Or we can report it by per thousand, 38.7 days per 1,000 person year. For non-diabetic women, numerator is 55,551, and the denominator is 36,653. So person time rate, the rate is equal to 5,511 divided by 36,653. So equal to 0.0139 days per person year. So when we convert it to per 1,000, 13.9 days is per 100,000 person year. It's clear, yeah? So
yes.
Next, yes. Example 2, we can see from this picture, based on the figure below, calculate the incidence rate of the disease, X. X indicates when they got a disease. We have 3 new cases during the follow-up. That is numerator. Total time at risk. How much is the total time? This column, the last column to the right, is the total time, yes. So we sum up them to obtain the total person year each participant is under observation. So incidence rate is equal to 3 new cases divided by total time at risk. So which is equal to 3 divided by 107.7. So incidence rate is equal to 0.028 per person years. When we present by 1,000 person year is 28 per 1,000 person year of the disease. Next slide, Kadura. Incidence risk or risk. The next measure of a disease burden is risk. So from this table I have explained before, we have a different, this table is called this 2x2 table or 2x2 table contingency table. We can see the exposure level, yes, no, disease status present or not present. So total cohort among exposed and the total cohort among not exposed or comparison. So A is yes, exposure yes, disease is present. B is exposure yes, disease is not present or not happen. C is exposure no disease present. D is exposure, no, and the disease is not present. So we can see from the explained the indicators at the bottom of the table. Next, you can see, you can read from it. So what I explained is that A plus B, the total number of exposed person. C plus D is the total number of unexposed. Incidence, therefore, incidence risk is a measure of disease occurrence over a defined period of time. So it is a proportion, is not rate, therefore takes values from 0 to 1 or 0% to 100%. Risk among exposed is risk among exposed is equal to disease among exposed divided by disease among total exposed. Risk among unexposed is equal to C exposed not, but disease occurred divided by disease occurred in the exposed plus disease not exposed not disease occurred. Next slide, we use this formula. Example, in the study of diabetes, 100 of the 119 diabetic men died during the 13 years follow-up period. Calculate the risk of days for these men. Yes, numerator 100 days among the diabetic men. Denominator 189, the total diabetic men included in the follow-up. So the risk is equal to 100 divided by 189 times 100 is equal to 52.9%. So you can try, try and develop your knowledge in the future. I am talking for the student, not for Kadura, sorry. So next, relative risk is measure of association. Relative risk is equal to risk of the disease among exposed divided by risk of the disease among unexposed. Relative risk is equal to A divided by A plus B divided overall divided by C divided by C plus D. So we use this formula. Risk difference. Risk difference. Risk of the disease in exposed minus risk of the disease in unexposed. Attributable risk is equal to risk of the disease among exposed minus risk of the disease among unexposed divided by risk of the disease among exposed. So using this expression in 2x2 table, A divided by A plus B minus C divided by C plus D divided by A plus B. Attributable risk is number of cases among the exposed group that could be eliminated if the exposure were removed. Bear in your mind. This is very important. Attributable risk is number of cases among the exposed group that could be eliminated if the exposure were removed. If we removed certain exposure, the number we will obtain is called attributable risk. Population attributable risk percentage is expressed as a percentage of a total risk in a population. Population attributable risk is excess risk of the disease in a total population attributable to the exposure. So a total risk in a population. Okay, risk difference and attributable risk. Reduction in risk which would be achieved if a population entirely unexposed. This is population attributable risk. It helps to determine which exposure relevant to public health in a community. So population attributable risk is equal to risk of the disease in a population minus risk of the disease among unexposed. Population attribute risk percentage is equal to risk of the disease in a population minus risk of the disease among unexposed divided by risk of the disease in a population times 100. Next. So risk difference is the subtraction between risk in exposed, the biggest column, the biggest histogram, and the risk in bar graph, risk in the exposed minus risk in the unexposed. The remaining portion is risk difference. Next. So example, now we have a cohort study. It started with children less than 12 years, 1,000 children. Family smoking status is exposure. 500 children exposed. Family non-smoker, 5,000 children not exposed. So we look at to the disease. Then among those exposed children, 300 develop the disease and 200 not develop the disease. Among those exposed, not exposed, 120 developed the disease and 380 not develop the disease. Therefore, calculate risk of the disease among exposed and unexposed, as previous we have did. B, calculate relative risk in the risk difference. So, solution for the example, risk among the exposed, 3,000 developed the disease divided by total exposed population, so 0.6, which is 60%. Risk among unexposed, 120 develops the disease among those unexposed or divided by total unexposed population. So it's equal to 0.24 or 24%. Therefore, relative risk is equal to the risk among exposed group 0.6 divided by risk among those unexposed group. So 2.5 risk. So exposed person, back, okay. So how we can interpret this risk? How we can interpret? Exposed person are 2.5 times more likely to develop the outcome disease than person who do not expose. So we can interpret the risk like this. Next slide. Khadura, next slide.
Yes.
Okay. Then solution for D, risk difference. The risk among exposed minus risk among unexposed. 60% minus 24% is equal to 36%. This is risk difference. Attributable risk is equal to risk among unexposed, 60%, minus risk among unexposed divided by risk among exposed group is equal to 60%. Interpretation of the attributable risk. 60% of cases among the exposed group could be eliminated if exposure were removed. If we removed the smoking among family, we can remove the risk of disease by 60%. Next. Next, Dr.
Yes.
Khadura, please, next.
Yes.
Okay. Example for population attributable risk or population percentage population attributable risk. Example, calculate population attributable risk and the percentage population attributable risk. So smoking in the lung cancer. So smoking yes, smoking no, lung cancer yes, lung cancer no. So 100 participants exposed smoking yes, in the lung cancer yes. 1,900 participants smoking yes, and the lung cancer no. 80 participants smoking no, but lung cancer yes. 7,920 participants smoking no, lung cancer no. Therefore, we can calculate risk in exposed group. How much is it? 100 divided by 2,000 equal to 0. Next slide, we can show, we can see. Next slide, please. Dr. Kadura. Okay, population attributable risk is equal to 0.018 minus 0.01. Let we see the first slide, please, please. Back one slide. So how we can calculate the risk in exposed group is 100 divided by 2,000 is equal to 0.050. 80 divided by 8,000, risk in exposed group 0.01. So total population risk in a population is 180 divided by 10,000 is equal to 0.018. Therefore, next slide. Population attributable risk is equal to 0.018 minus 0.01 is equal to 0.008. Percent population attributable risk is equal to population attributable risk in a population minus attributable risk or risk in an exposed group divided by risk in exposed group or in population, in general population times 100 is equal to 44%. Interpretation: 44% of lung cancer in the population could be prevented if the use of smoking were eliminated. It makes sense, yeah?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Next, you can practice. Is very easy. Show rate ratio. The other measure of association is rate ratio in court during court study. Rate ratio is the ratio of incidence rate among exposed group to the incidence rate among unexposed group. So we have exposed group incidence rate divided by the rate incidence rate in the unexposed group. Example 1. The diabetes follow-up study includes 200 similar study, 218 diabetic women in the 3,823 non-diabetic women. By the end of the study, 72 of the diabetic women and the 511 of the non-diabetic women had died. The diabetic women were observed for a total of 1,862 per year. The non-diabetic women were observed for a total of 36,653 per year. Calculate the rate ratio of days related to diabetic among women. Next slide. Before we have the slide, another slide. Yes. Yes. So diabetic status, yes, no. Similar study. So rate ratio is equal to incidence rate of the disease among exposed 0.0387 and the incidence rate of the disease among unexposed 0.0139.
So please go to the interpretation, dear Tola, dear Dr. Tola.
Hello?
I suppose you go to the interpretation as your calculation is so clear here. It's nice.
Okay, very good. Okay, okay. So interpretation, the rate of mortality was 2.78 times more likely occurred among women who had diabetic compared to more women who did not have diabetic. So the interpretation is like this. Thank you very much. It's very good. If you have any questions, suggestion, you're welcome.
I also thank you very much for your lecture. It's a very nice presentation. Our time is close to end. We just remain with 1 minute. But if anyone has any question, he